just passed 11:15 on Monday, the 24th of November. My name is Chris Hattingh, Executive Director at the Centre for Risk Analysis, joined today by CRA Research Associate Ofentse Davhie, and we are going to discuss the latest iteration of the G20 Leaders Summit, held, of course, over the past weekend in Johannesburg. So for the first time on African soil, the Leaders Summit. Lots of dignitaries, lots of heads of state, some heads of state choosing not to attend. We'll get into those particular permutations, but lots of hype around the event. We had a few of our still operational Gripen fighter aircraft flying over Johannesburg and Pretoria over the last few days. From my point of view, nice to see at least some of that. I think one or two of our Roy Falk helicopters as well that are still operational. I quite like a show of force every now and then from a SANDF point of view. But in any case, we'll get into what we thought of the summit, what was agreed upon, maybe what was not agreed upon, who was in the room, who wasn't in the room, and exactly what comes out of this particular summit. Ofentse, just before I hand over to you to get your initial thoughts, I'll say just from my point of view, to give props to the organizers. I think from a pageantry point of view, quite well done. Didn't seem like there were any serious issues. However, I should also stress that the summit, itself, it doesn't magically fix South Africa's underlying weak growth fundamentals, our consistently high unemployment rate, inconsistent service delivery by local governments, especially in Johannesburg. There's also a risk that the fact that the summit went relatively well and smoothly gives President Ramaphosa and the ANC and the Government of National Unity the feeling that things are fine. Things are on track, they're in control, domestically they're doing well, and internationally that they're still very important, that they are still a moral superpower, and it might risk breeding that perception amongst themselves that they are still this heavyweight and they don't really need to shift anything in their foreign policy or geo-economic dealings that have been weak and have been glaring gaps in the last year or so, exposed, I think, especially by US President Donald Trump. But in any case, let's get into some of the permutations. The details are on the summit. Ofentse, firstly to you, any initial thoughts? And just before you unmute, of course, I'll invite everyone joining us. Thank you all for making time here. If you have any questions, comments, discussion points for us to consider, please drop those in the comment section of the respective platform on which you are watching. Helps us make sense of these things as well as we try to build and increase our own analysis and research into things like the summit and what it means for businesses operating in South Africa. Ofentse, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. My initial thought on the summit and also on South Africa's presidency of the G20 as a whole, I would say I would consider it a success, a thumbs up. It ticked all the boxes that it wanted to take in terms of logistics. All the meetings, over 130 meetings were held across the country, across the entire year. The summit went well as well. All the leaders showed face, and those that did attend in terms of heads of states, but all the countries except for one were represented, which is still a win. All of this, I also thought about it actually earlier, is that there were meetings on the side between European leaders, between quote-unquote Western leaders, discussing their own issues abroad and domestically. And all of this was happening in Johannesburg. There was a statement issued by the European Union on the latest Ukraine plan drafted by the US. The outcome of that document was from a meeting that was held on the sideline of the G20 in Johannesburg. Something like that. Although we have hosted many international forums in South Africa, we haven't seen something like that ever in the history of South Africa. So it's quite exciting it was exciting to see. It showed that there is some relevancy that South Africa still holds, and all these leaders use their time wisely when gathering together to use this multilateral platform, not only to strengthen the agenda of the G20, but also to strengthen their own shared agendas amongst their own regional blocs or bilateral or trilateral relations. Also, finally, I'd also like to say that despite how nice the summit was this past weekend, it would have been a whole lot better if South Africa wasn't going through the already governance and service delivery issues that you're talking about. If GDP growth was at 5% per year and unemployment rate was at 3% instead of 30%, all of this would have made the summit a whole lot more to celebrate. Instead, it's a weekend where we forget about our problems and now we're back to reality where we shouldn't even be in these kinds of problems.
I saw a comment to that effect. I think it was on X, where someone said, yeah, we're all South Africans are all happy this weekend, all singing from the same hymn sheet, talking about what a success the summit is. But as soon as the clock strikes midnight going into Monday, we're at each other's throats again. So I think that's also important for our government to keep in mind, like how one uses the momentum from these kinds of events. And this has happened before where, something like the 2010 Football World Cup, the investment in infrastructure, we saw our gross fixed capital formation increasing. We came, at that point, we were coming out of a period of relatively high economic growth, and we had that momentum on the international stage. We host these events, and then it's similar to what we've referred to the GNU as well, a bit of a sugar high. So the boost is great, the sentiment is great, but there's nothing long-term in sort of a nutritious sense from an economic growth or investment job creation point of view that comes out of it. Do you think that's still a risk from this particular G20, that the hype, is a bit too much of a high point, and then we risk losing sight of those fundamentals?
Well, the good thing that came out of the summit is the declaration, if I dare call it a declaration, moving out the politics around the semantics of the outcome document. I'll just call it a declaration for now. And the good thing about that is that South Africans can and should use and treat this declaration as a benchmark for the government of national unity, especially given the cost in hosting over 130 meetings and the summit in the past year and also the past weekend. The commitments on the declaration itself speak on strengthening revenue administration, broadening the tax base, and improving debt sustainability. And these issues, they're not just abstract. These are standards our own Department of Treasury, our own Treasury has now endorsed on a global stage. That means that with future budgets, with future medium-term budget proposal statements, these issues or these sentiments that have been endorsed by the South African government needs to be tested by these principles on whether tax collection is becoming more efficient, on whether the state is widening the tax base rather than leaning on a shrinking load. So one good thing that comes out of the summit is the declaration, because even though we go back to reality and we have to face all these issues, South Africa, at least the South African government, the GNU, they can't champion these positions on an international stage and then ignore them at home. The declaration has given the public, South African voters, a concrete yardstick to hold the GNU to its own commitments. And at least this should be and ought to be used to hold the GNU accountable up until 2029 on whether this very expensive PDF document was just used or will be used to actually produce change, or it's just for a show that we hosted on the previous weekend and we forget about it and it collects dust.
On that point, in the declaration, in the sort of chair's summary, so if we can include all the different kinds of terminology, depending from what angle one is pursuing it, regardless of the terminology, if you look at some of the content, things like combating corruption, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that to me sort of jumped out immediately if you look at the conduct by the ANC specifically over the last 15 to 20 years. If we look at the waste and corruption in our public sector, in our SOEs, it does frustrate one, many South African taxpayers, I think, especially, to say you're committing to these lofty ideals, but what practically, are you going to do with this, like in terms of policy and legislative reform? Because it's great to promise it and commit to it, as President Ramaphosa often does in his investment summits and promises of higher rates of investment, but then we don't see that realized. So I think, again, here, Ofentse, we come back to, how is the South African state going to use some of this that comes out of the summit in a practical sense? And not to say that, let's assume if one ideologically says that the declaration or the summary was the best thing from an ideological or policy point of view. How you implement it, and you can't do it overnight. So how you do that in sort of steps, I think, over time, will be interesting to see how the GNU uses it or not. But then secondly, how it's used or not used to support sort of the very concept of multilateralism, and that the G20 represents that. Because if it's not used effectively, I mean, citizens, I think there's already rising frustration with these multilateral platforms and multilateralism. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so going into the outcome document in itself, the Johannesburg Declaration or Chair Statement, it's nice to split the priorities it sets out into two clusters: the development agenda and the finance agenda, of which the respective countries have already been implementing before the signing of this declaration. And other ideals may also be lofty when trying to approach it in a multilateral sense. So on the development agenda side, we see that leaders put a lot of weight on resilience and long-term structural transformations, these nice high-level buzzwords that are typically used in these documents. They talk about some good things they talk about is strengthening disaster risk systems, so being able to be resilient to a potential health pandemic or to natural disasters, from flooding to wildfires. There should be some financing revolved around that into preparation and into recovery, and also into preventative measures. There's also in the declaration talks on improving food security. There's a big highlight as well on energy transition for energy transition as a way to expand rather than shrink an economy. Energy transition is particularly focused on low-income countries, and of course, particularly focused on Africa as a continent. And something like that, we've already seen that, for example, the EU has partnered with South Africa for probably the past decade now, investing in South Africa's just energy transition implementation plan. And so some of these agendas have been implemented already, and this just reaffirms the call for some of these things. And this is the development agenda side. Moving on to the finance agenda, and myself as a G20 originalist, I would say the finance agenda is the most important part of the declaration. It openly acknowledges the reality of high debt burdens and the elevated cost of capital across many low-income and emerging economies. It calls for a more responsive international financial architecture, better coordination among creditors, and some transparency to support countries that are managing these debt risks, obviously with a particular focus on Africa and the African continent, because it's African countries who are historically the largest borrowers. So the G20 coming together and acknowledging that this is a serious issue is good. However, important to note that the G20 is an informal forum, and the declaration or chair statement or whatever document that comes out of any of these summits in the past 20 years, none of them have legal obligations. It's all a gentleman's agreement. So it depends on the political will of the respective members of the G20 to actually implement these reforms. Like I mentioned earlier with the just energy transition, the EU and other European countries have been playing along and will be participating in all of those kinds of reforms and the development agenda. On the finance agenda, it's a bit more difficult. It requires some coordination, some discipline as well, and of course, some political will on whether these global north countries are willing to help ease the burden of debt to the global south countries. And the United States already has an issue with that, and to the point that they didn't even attend the summit. All the other countries may be there, may give the nice speeches, but will they actually implement any of these things and have their countries put a priority on African countries, on quote unquote global south countries, on low income and emerging economies?
Just on that point around global sort of institutions of financing and the desire from some countries, from some developing countries, for some of those systems to be reformed and reshaped. There is there is a view, and I think with some merit, that some of those emerging and developing governments and countries, they will, they'll make their own domestic spending policy choices, they'll run up debt, and then they go to more developed countries like the US or European countries and say, we need to reform, quote unquote, the World Bank or the IMF because we can't deal with these debt burdens, when they themselves sort of ran up those high debt burdens in any case. So there is a bit of an element there. I wonder about how one engages then with countries like the US and others, where you say, you made your own domestic policy choices, now you're coming to us and trying to, it's a bit along the sort of begging bowl lines. Do you think there's an element of merit in that?
There definitely is an element of merit in that, and it's acknowledged in the declaration itself. The points that I mentioned earlier on what as South Africans we should hold the Treasury accountable for. There are some points of the declaration that calls for these countries that are the highest borrowers to act fiscally more responsible and to increase their own tax bases and to limit the need to borrow. So the obligations aren't only from the creditors, but they're also from the debtor side on how to responsibly manage any debt risks. There's also a call as well on a call to reforming multilateral development banks into using their balance sheets to increase their flow of sustainable finance for infrastructure. And these development banks can also be found in the African continent itself. So there are points in the declaration that try to hold both sides accountable. We know in the US they're not going to play along, although they should have used this platform to also hold the borrowers accountable. But all the other G20 members played their part, and they would be more willing to participate in an engagement where someone's asking for debt relief because there's this agreement on the table where each side can be held accountable.
Ofentse, just on the point around multilateralism and maybe how it's being challenged in this current moment. So we had the summit itself, but you also, interestingly, and one specific sort of side meeting I want to highlight was between the leaders of India, Brazil, and South Africa. And they met as part of what is called the IBSA Forum. It's the first time in more than a decade that the leaders are gathering under the auspices of the grouping, although foreign ministers have done so regularly over the years. According to a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, India's participation in the IBSA and the G20 is quote-unquote significant as nations try de-risking and diversifying supply chains. Do you think we're going to see sort of geopolitics, multilateralism, these things maybe, fracturing a bit into these more regional subgroupings or smaller groups, things like, this IBSA, things maybe like BRICS, where it's just fewer countries, maybe on the African continent, there's just so much opportunity for the African Union to deal, in a hard-nosed way with the challenges facing the continent and African countries and citizens. Do you think that that's going to sort of increase these more focused groupings?
I'm a bit skeptical on whether that would be the case. IBSA has been around for longer than BRICS has been in its current formation. And I didn't actually know that the heads of states of IBSA haven't met together in that long. So it just goes to show that these, from multilateralism even down to trilateralism, it's a bit difficult to try agree firmly onto something and to implement it justly. Only time will tell if the rising tensions of protectionism from superpowers will get these smaller groups to gather together and on a common cause and to try to be more resilient to the new global restructuring that's going on amid the G2 world that others would say we live in between the US and China. But no, I'm a bit skeptical on whether those smaller groups will gather together and try to be any more effective. The next time IBSA meets at a head of state level probably won't happen next year, won't happen anytime soon. And we saw as well during the G20 summit that that tangible trade deals were signed on a bilateral level across many of the countries that were engaging with, whether with South Africa or Asian countries with Asian countries, or even all the other African countries that came in as observers of the G20, who managed to strike deals with other European countries and Asian countries as well. Some tangible outcomes came out of the past weekend. Out of IPSA, we don't get anything like that. I think once it's more than two parties involved, it's a bit more difficult to align onto creating a tangible outcome. So no, I don't have too much hope for IPSA becoming a force to reckon with. That, as well as BRICS. BRICS has never produced a trade agreement in amongst itself. There's just these declarations that are not legally binding, and yeah, the same with multilateral platforms as well. It all depends on the political will of the members within these institutions. A nice thing about the G20 is that the EU is playing along. The European countries are playing along. They want to, especially France. They want to show that their words, their commitments, that you can hold them accountable to them, and they try to implement them as much as they can. If despite the G20 declarations not being legally binding, between India, Brazil, and South Africa, it may look good on paper of them coming together, but if nothing tangible comes out of it, I don't think it's something we should really take seriously.
I think that's a very good point. A lot of this stuff looks good on paper, but then in actual implementation, that's often where things are lacking. Ofentse, if we can talk a little bit about the US choosing to not attend this latest summit. Sort of near the end of last week, we had some shifting in that regard, wanting to at least a handover to take place. So that, because of course the US takes over the presidency of the G20 next year, South Africa through the presidency, through DIRCO, really, I think, trying to fight their corner and saying, this isn't protocol, this isn't how things should have been done last minute. On the handover, I believe DIRCO, the latest they indicated that the handover will still take place, but at DIRCO offices and not from head of state. It wouldn't be from President Ramaphosa to considered a lower sort of level person. It would have to be head of state to head of state, or then sort of lower official on the South African side to lower official on the US side. You did have, I just want to highlight one particular quote. So this was from the Deputy Press Secretary, the US Deputy Press Secretary, Anna Kelly, who stated that President Ramaphosa was, quote, refusing to facilitate a smooth transition of the G20 presidency. She added that this, coupled with South Africa's push to issue a G20 leaders declaration, despite consistent and robust US objections, underscores the fact that they have weaponized their G20 presidency to undermine the G20's founding principles, end quote. And just the last point, that statement from the Deputy Press Secretary said that President Trump looks forward to, quote unquote, restoring legitimacy to the G20 next year. If you talk about weaponizing different platforms and different processes, I think the Trump administration has been quite focused in that regard to the US's own benefit to do that. However, sort of putting South Africa on the spot. What do you make of how South Africa tried to deal with this whole thing for the last year? Clear differences in ideology and policy between the two governments, but also the G20 summit specifically, sort of things coming to a head now. South Africa trying to play the protocol line, the Trump administration, I think, continuing in its general foreign policy engagements in a more unilateral way. So we are the world's most important economy. We're all the world's most important military. We're going to put forward certain requirements and how we expect you to engage with us, and let the consequences come when they arrive.
So to lay out the timeline, to give the South African government some credit, back in May at that interesting Oval Office meeting between President Ramaphosa and Trump, Ramaphosa said to Trump himself that I would like to hand over the baton to you, the gavel in this case, and that I don't want to hand it to an empty seat. He said it to his face, that I want to hand over to you. And it was just the ball was in the United States court. Moving forward, of course, President Trump said he's not going to go, but Vice President J.D. Vance will join. And then there was a speech he was given in Miami for a business conference where he confused South America for South Africa, saying that people from South Africa are fleeing the communist tyranny of South Africa and flooding into Miami. Of course, he meant to say South America, and instead of correcting himself, he doubled down and saying, okay, no, J.D. Vance is not going to the G20, no one is going, and use some, he hasn't said there's a genocide in South Africa for quite a few months, but he uses some euphemisms to suggest that, speaking of persecution and so on and so on. So to give South Africa credit, they've been asking the United States to please come. They were certain that they were going to come, and they didn't come. And in this final week, we saw, at least last week, we saw South Africa being a bit confident, and recognizing that, you know what, if they don't want to come over, then they don't have to come over. And we see that you're offering your charge d'affaires to come for the handover ceremony, but we are going to have to decline because we don't want to see the head of state of South Africa handing it over to a diplomat. All of that is fair in terms of protocol. The South Africa's G20 presidency actually ends on the 30th of November. So sometime this week, the handover will have to happen. And it's not only just handing over a gavel from one person to another. There's also a lot of administration that has to go around it. For example, just the G20 website, g20.org, that needs to be handed over from South Africa to the United States. So all of that will need to happen within this week. And I reckon it will happen. Just the level between the engagement has to be reciprocated. And unfortunately, it was a break in tradition, that we saw yesterday, where President Ramaphosa just banged the gavel and just put it down on the table rather than handing it over to President Trump, something that both countries should want to see, that all the G20 members should want to see, but did not happen. So it is an unfortunate event that happened, but fortunately it did not overshadow the whole summit. I would say a lot of the real work, which was getting a declaration out, but also with all the bilateral engagements and trilateral engagements and multilateral engagements that happened on the side of the G20 summit. That's the highlight of the summit, and not the boycott. And finally, on that, with the comments from the Deputy Press Secretary, we can see that the G20 next day is going to look completely different. It's going to be streamlined. I mentioned earlier that with the declaration, we see there's a development agenda and a finance agenda. It's safe to say that the development agenda is going to get scrapped and will no longer be there. We saw a hint of this when the G20 for 2026 was announced in the Oval Office, and the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that the G20 has a bloated agenda and needs to be streamlined and go to a back to basics model, referring to its original intention back in 1999 when it was first formed, and also in 2008 when the G20 Leadership Summit was first conceptualized, which is that the grouping is meant to be a crisis steering committee that focuses on macroeconomics and financial coordination. These other development issues, such as food security and energy transitions, although you can indirectly connect them to financial coordination, the United States completely disagrees. And as well, as you mentioned, the ideological disputes as well, with the withdrawal from any climate change obligations by the United States on these multilateral platforms as well. Adding onto the concerns by the United States, there was also a concern from Argentina, where the foreign affairs minister said in his speech at the G20 summit that they do not agree with the declaration in its current form, and the dispute they had was how it tackles the situation in the Middle East. It had a fundamental disagreement with it there, and hours later, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Argentina released a press statement explicitly condemning the South African presidency for not carrying out the consensus rule of the G20. Argentina has disagreed with the declaration before in the past, but I've never seen it release a statement criticizing a government explicitly for not following the rules of the G20. So it's not only the United States, but also Argentina have an issue. And I think the two of them will rally together in trying to streamline the G20 from being what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called the G100, and it'll go back down to a G20 that's focused purely on what it was meant to be, a macroeconomic and financial crisis steering committee.
I think there is also something in that in terms of trying to make things a bit more streamlined. If you look at the different challenges that countries face nowadays, the risk of having these bloated plans and agendas, and it's almost, it looks like it is busy work. You look like you're tackling everything, but you don't want to commit to the sort of boring, necessary work of things like, what policies in your country are in place that make investing and job creation and growth more difficult. From a legislation point of view, in South Africa's case, things like expropriation without compensation, more aggressive affirmative action policies. Might there be anything, that in your own policy house makes doing business more difficult, where something like the G20 gives you the chance to then be distracted from that in a way, because you're part of this club of the world's most important economies, where if you look at South Africa's economic performance, the question is, should a country like South Africa, from a soft power point of view, maybe there is still some of that, and from a diplomacy point of view, yes, be part of the G20. But from hard reality point of view, like economic growth, rates of crime and corruption, should you still be there? I think there is something in there in terms of how now the handover to the US, how does South Africa deal with that moment, and how this particular platform of multilateralism, the G20, might shift to focus on the things that you've highlighted. If South Africa wanted to, play a bit smarter in this new world, I think they would recognize that. But I suspect that's not going to happen.
Just to add on that as well, former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel, he said in an interview last week that the G20 has grown too big, has grown too diverse, quoting what he said, saying that now it's become a forum where you're talking about everything and talking about nothing at the same time. And a comment like that coming from him is actually significant, and it should be noted because he was there in 1999 when the G20 was first formed. He was there in 2007 when South Africa held the presidency of the G20, and he was the chairperson of the G20 then. And he was there as well in 2008 when it got up to the leadership summit. So a comment like that coming from him, and not from the United States, but from here at home, where someone admits that yes, the G20 has grown a bit too big, the agenda is bloated, and we've come to a point where we are talking about these important issues. They're also important to talk about, but because we're talking about so many issues, we're basically not talking about anything at all, because it's just too much to implement all of this, and we just need to redirect our focus onto the purpose of the G20, which is global financial coordination to prevent any possible crises or to mitigate a current one.
Ofentse, from a performance point of view, if you look at the different heads of state and other senior officials that were in attendance at the Leaders Summit, who stood out to you? If you had to give a report card in terms of who used the cameras and all that sort of thing to try and gain some attention for themselves and maybe on their own country sort of prospects, was there anyone specifically, or maybe, I don't know, top two or three that stood out, that they were, despite all the ideological stuff, we're just gonna, let's treat this particularly as a bit of a sort of light-hearted moment? Who used it well, do you think?
I think everyone can agree on this, which is that it was the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He was the top vlogger of the G20. His account was basically competing with the official G20 social media accounts. It was, as well, everyone likes Prime Minister Modi, and you can see why, because he's very he's very engaging with his counterpart as well, and his PR team is clearly doing a good job at reflecting that. Another leader I did appreciate as well is the French President Macron. He released a wholesome video of him and President Ramaphosa chatting, and him congratulating Ramaphosa on the G20 summit. But as well, all the other leaders, they all gave a heartfelt congratulations to the president, to South Africa, and overall, all the heads of states that were in attendance looked like they were very satisfied with the outcome. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer because he did say this is lighthearted, but something I do want to point out is that on the family photo, not the extended family photo, but just the family photo of the G20, the Italian Prime Minister Meloni was not in the photo. So I don't know why. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she just didn't want to be part of that photo. I'll leave that for everyone to speculate.
Ofentse, just on on South Africa's participation in the G20 and in other forums like BRICS and many others. Was there anything in any particular statements, either by President Ramaphosa or Minister Lamola or any others, that gave you any sort of signs or clues as to, where South Africa is leaning in terms of partnerships? Is South Africa sort of continuing to talk about non-alignment, but then actually practicing active alignment to certain countries? There definitely wasn't a shift towards the US, for example, but might there have been other shifts to other countries that could be unexpected, do you think?
I would say nothing to touch on the non-alignment policy. However, there was a huge emphasis from President Ramaphosa in his opening statement, in like the first 3 or 5 lines of his speech, on emphasizing the importance of multilateralism. And all the other leaders that spoke after him echoed that as well, the importance of multilateralism. So on the case of speaking about it, the dialogue, on a talking point basis, everyone supports this idea, this concept of multilateralism. But of course, the two parties, the two actors that are potentially undermining the case for multilateralism, they were not in the room, and that's the President of the United States and the President of China. None of them were there to physically say, we are here for multilateral platforms, we support multilateralism, it's still relevant. All the other G20 members spoke on multilateralism, said the G20 is still relevant. The Finnish Prime Minister, actually, he added that the G20's existence is at risk. So he notices, at least he notices, and he's very good at his speeches. He notices the threat and the limitations of multilateralism, but he also speaks of the importance of still upholding it. So in terms of the words, in terms of the speeches, it all shows that this concept, this idea is still supported. But when it comes to when it gets to the playing field, it's only hard power that talks. It's the G2 that talks. It's the United States and China, and we'll see where each of the members within the G20 align in terms of this G2 world. But South Africa itself, this past weekend, did not show an alignment to either side, and neither did any of the G20 countries during the past weekend. They all spoke on the relevance of the G20 and the importance of multilateralism.
Ofentse, in recent sort of research that you've done for the CRA, you highlighted in the ongoing development of the relationship between South Africa and the US, two versions of the US-South Africa Bilateral Review Act that are continuing to wend their way through the House, the US House and the Senate. You mentioned in this morning's risk alert that we send to clients every Monday morning at 7 a.m., you mentioned and highlighted the potential of the disagreement and the different ways of viewing the G20 between South Africa and the US, how that could then manifest possibly in things like increasing the reciprocal tariffs again. You've got these different versions of the Review Act on the table. They could, be pursued again now and pushed sort of further on the agenda. What do you make of how the US could now react to how the summit has played out, despite their objections that they lodged to South Africa at repeated points and said, don't try and force a consensus, don't put this out. What do you make of the sort of potentialities in terms of how the Trump administration could now voice its disagreement and its displeasure with how South Africa has conducted itself and used the G20 platform?
So in the 48 hours of the G20 summit, South Africa held this leverage that it used and abused, and everyone was happy about it. But now, starting from the 1st of December up until the 30th of November of 2026, it's the United States that's going to hold that leverage now. And I have a theory that after seeing the developments of this past weekend accumulating on top of the already tense relations between the two nations, the G20 will easily be used as a coercion tool by the United States against South Africa. Because the G20 is an informal forum, it's not like the UN Security Council where you can just bar someone from attending. The G20, there is no constitution, there is no rule book that's legally binding. So the games of the rules of the game of the G20 and hosting it, they're really going to be tested next year under the presidency of the United States, and they will definitely be used to coerce South Africa. A scenario that can easily be seen is you're not sending a delegation, your president is not welcome to join the Miami summit in November 2026. And of course, South Africa will want to participate because it's part of the Troika system as well, the Troika being the previous, current, and next presidency of the G20. It's part of that system, and the purpose of that system is for continuation of the agenda of the G20. That the South Africa can easily be left out of that Troika system, be left out of any decision-making process during the presidency of the United States. There were talks on the sidelines of some ministers being interviewed by the SABC that even if the United States does not carry out what's been agreed this year, if the United States does not carry out next year, the UK will still gladly continue what South Africa has adopted this year because the UK hosts the G20 the following year after the United States. So some leverage, it's going to be used as a tool of leverage and coercion next year. We can expect it along with tariffs, along with any other mechanism for President Trump to use against President Ramaphosa. And I think there's going to be a lot that's keeping us busy next year in terms of analyzing US-SA relations, just purely because of the past 2 days.
No, absolutely. Let's see exactly how that shakes out. Ofentse, I think we're going to come towards the end of our conversation, but just maybe a last point, and we started off on this note about how, despite the pageantry and the hype and all that kind of thing, the summit doesn't magically fix the policy and legislative issues that continue to hold back growth in South Africa, that prevent doing business, that make it riskier, that make South Africa less attractive than many other developing and emerging economies. I saw some analysis in the line this weekend that how the Trump administration has engaged with South Africa's G20 presidency and how Ramaphosa has sort of played the process, it could boost the ANC's prospects going forward. Just last week, we had new polling released by the Social Research Foundation, and they had the ANC on 37% and the DA on 32%. That poll had a 4% margin of error, I believe. That analysis to me, I don't think really holds water. I don't think South Africans, while they might have, some will have enjoyed the weekend and they might have changed their banners on social media to a South Africa flag, it doesn't then translate to this cures, I think, the ANC's long-term electoral decline. What do you think of that? Do you think, this could boost the ANC going into the next local government elections? Those should happen by the end of 2026, early 2027. So I guess many opportunities for the ANC to remind voters what the party is all about.
Yeah, end of a sugar high. After this weekend, we're going to snap back to reality and we're going to remember the ANC for what it is. So, yes, this past weekend, especially this past weekend as a whole, just with the G20 and the successes in terms of logistics, aesthetics, all the other leaders congratulating South Africa and congratulating specifically President Ramaphosa. It all looked good for Ramaphosa and also for the ANC. It all looks good for them. And on top of that, with the retaliation against the US, a lot of people, of course, despite political disagreements, everyone's going to want to protect their own country, protect their own president, and defend them. So in terms of that, definitely the ANC scored some brownie points, but it's not going to last until 12 months, until the next election. We saw a glimpse of this recency bias in Poland when Poland was done around the budget this year, where the ANC was proposing a VAT increase and the DA was against the VAT increase. And the Poland results that came out of them showed the DA Poland higher than the ANC. That Poland was based off of that event and of the mood of the feeling during that particular moment in the timeline. And then obviously after that, it would regulate to what it ordinarily is. The SRF Poland came at the right time because it came just before this hype of the G20. So we can trust the numbers that came out of this current SRF Poland. If Poland were to be done today, the numbers would look completely different. But that's because of the spike it got from a big event that just happened. And after a few weeks, after a few months, and definitely before or at least definitely by the local government elections in late next year, early 2027, the numbers will not look so good for the ANC. But at the moment, they should enjoy the popularity. There's a lot of celebrating going on, but in a few weeks, in a few months, people will recalibrate to their original feelings and moods to the political actors at play.
I definitely agree with you. I think, as we've highlighted in today's discussion and mentioned beforehand as well, South Africa, well, the ANC specifically, should I say, has seen itself for many years as a moral superpower. And in many ways, this administration, US administration, has been puncturing that perception that the party has of itself. So in this world of shifting multilateralism and platforms like the G20, where hard power, I think, counts a lot more, where real politic counts for a lot more than moral politic, it is a different kind of moment. So let's see if South Africa uses any of this momentum from the G20. Let's see in terms of just the country's investment case. There has been more positive sentiment. We talked about this in the latest medium-term budget briefing that we delivered after the budget statement, that the sentiment might look good, the JSE is performing well, but the growth fundamentals we don't think have shifted in a sense to make us think, we're in a new era of higher growth rates and better performing service delivery. But let's see how it all plays out. Ofentse, I'm going to thank you very much for your time, all of your work on these and related matters. You will be writing a lot more on this, putting out notes on things like the incoming US ambassador to South Africa, what that means for South Africa and the relationship, and I'm sure much more else in geopolitics and geoeconomics. So we look forward to that. To all of you who joined us, thank you very much for making time on this Monday morning, and we really do appreciate your engagement. And until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.